Good afternoon and welcome. Today we are going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about a movie review instead of Warhammer 40K issues. I went and saw Tenet this weekend and I really wanted to get back into the whole movie theater going experience because that's just something that I think has been missing in, American life for the past few months, and it's something that we can all kind of join around a little bit. And it really seemed like a good idea because Tenet is one of those tentpole Christopher Nolan movies that everybody can really enjoy. So I went into it. I haven't really seen much about it. I knew it was like back and forth time or something like that. And usually with these Christopher Nolan movies, you don't want to get too much forethought about what it's going to be about because the surprises and the twists and the way that it actually functions, it's part of the fun of seeing a Christopher Nolan movie. And I gotta say, this one wasn't quite as great as the other ones. So it was a good movie. I'm not gonna say don't go see it. I would say maybe I would recommend it depending on what other movies are out there. And since there's nothing out there, and it's been 7 months since probably anybody's been to the theater, it's not a bad movie to kind of get back into the theater with. It's bombastic. It has a lot of good visuals. It kind of makes you think sometimes. It's the usual Christopher Nolan fanfare that you would expect. But that's not to say that it was all successful. So before we get into any sort of spoilers, I'd like to just go over generally what I thought about the movie. The main actor in this movie, I think, is one of the weak points, and frankly, all the actors are. There's not the usual Christopher Nolan, archetypes that you have in all the other movies. Michael Caine shows up for a second, and he's good as always. But outside of that, there are a bunch of faces that you've never really seen in any of his other movies. So I think a Tom Hardy would have done well here. A Even Leo might have done okay, but I'm not sure that would have been good for him. But I just feel like some of the actors didn't have kind of the screen presence that most of his movies have to kind of carry them in the same way that, say, a Daniel Craig carries a James Bond movie. And most of these Christopher Nolan movies, they're basically just James Bond movies on some sort of trip, right? So Inception, that's James Bond on shrooms. This movie is James Bond on DMT or something. I don't know. It's just one of those things where his movies really rely on the actors to carry the scripts because the scripts are very, very intense and they can get kind of convoluted most of the time. And in this case, the characters didn't seem to fit the script. But that's not to say that they couldn't have. I do really think that the script in this movie could have used a lot of work. I've read some reports that he spent 10 years thinking about it and 5 years writing it. And at the end of the day, it does kind of feel like the script gets in its own way. So when you see Interstellar and you see some of the other Christopher Nolan movies, Inception, or even Batman to a certain degree, the scripts can get kind of complicated, but they still kind of tie back to themselves pretty well. And they're just complicated enough that you can get 2.5 hours of that plot in that doesn't boggle the mind too much, and it doesn't get it in its own way. It still gives you just enough to think about, but it doesn't make it so hard to think about it that it kind of doesn't make any sense, right? This movie kind of falls into that trap. It tries to think too hard. So if you think of the movie Edge of Tomorrow, actually I think that's really the movie that this most closely mimics in some weird ways. That movie, the reason that it works in that kind of repetitive nature is because of its linearity. Even though there's repetition of the same day over and over and over again, it's very linear. When you start moving backwards in time, like this movie does, it's a time-based movie, obviously. It it kind of starts to fall apart. So as the movie begins, you start getting a little bit of a glimpse here, a little bit of a glimpse there of what's actually going on. And I'm sure if I was to see the movie again, I would be able to tell that there's a few seeds laid here and there's a few seeds laid there that make it kind of more intuitive about where the movie's going to go. But currently, kind of as it stands, the first act, the second act, and the third act, they don't really stand apart from each other. It kind of just moves along, and nothing really ties back together, kind of in the way you would expect in a time travel movie. It kind of just seems that towards the end of the movie, some of the resolutions are kind of just shoved in there to make it so that the plot can actually function. There's a few moments where there are visual cues to why this happened, but that visual cue wasn't laid earlier in the movie or it didn't have anything to do with the character actually. It's just kind of there to tie those two scenes together and to tie the forward time and the backwards time together. So generally speaking, it felt like a weak time travel movie. It felt like, the ultimate expression of what Christopher Nolan can do, but he just didn't really execute it like he has before. Part of the problem there too is that he never really committed to the visuals of it. It almost felt like he wasn't sure how to make the visuals work. So you have, that famous scene from Inception, the hallway scene where they're fighting in the hallways, moving in all kinds of directions. You never really have anything like that here. There's a few scenes where you can tell that they're doing things forwards and backwards at the same time, but it feels like the director had a hard time wrapping his head around it, which makes sense, right? I'm not blaming him for not being able to direct the movie or anything like that. It just it didn't quite execute as well as you would have liked. There are certain scenes that while you're watching them, it looks cool, and then you see the reverse later, and it looks even cooler because now you know what's actually going on. But that happens too few and far between. All the other times where there's actually the time travel contingent actually occurring, really you're just confused. It doesn't feel natural. It feels forced to make sure that it works out. So really, it's a cool looking movie. The other issue is that there's not there's not the thoughtful process that you usually have at the end of a Christopher Nolan movie, where you know Inception, Interstellar, even Batman, the last one. You think about it for a while. You try and figure out where the movie's actually going. Where the story goes afterwards. There's usually that fade to black at the end that ends on a very specific note where could he or could he is the totem gonna fall or is it not? Did Batman survive or did he not? It doesn't it doesn't have that. At the end of the movie when it's over and it does the cut to black, you don't you don't really care where it's gonna go after that because nothing has happened to that point to make you care. It's just a jumbled mess that got there, and it started kind of slow, and then it wrapped up too quickly. The concept of it didn't they didn't work into the concept. The concept was just there the whole time, and then when it escalated too far. So I would say it's an enjoyable movie. It's not nearly one of his best. I think right now you could say that all of the Batman movies are better. Inception was better. Interstellar was better, and maybe put it after that. But even his older movies before that were better. This really is the weakest of the Christopher Nolan movies. I That's not to say it was a bad movie. There's plenty of worse movies out there. So it's still recommendable to watch. The music is really good. Has a very nice discordant soundtrack that kind of goes back and forth, along with the visuals as they go back and forth. So that was really nice as well. Some of the dialogue was hard to hear for some of the movie, and I don't want to explain why, but there's a lot of muffled voices in the movie that make it difficult to really make out what's going on. And also, the gunfire in the movie, it doesn't sound quite right. It sounds good. It's weighty. It has that crack to it, but it also sounds kind of muffled. I'm not really sure what happened to the sound in this movie, but it wasn't as well. The audio wasn't quite as pleasing as other Christopher Nolan movies. It didn't have the weighty soundtrack that other Christopher Nolan movies have had. It just had the kind of soundtrack that was kind of upbeat and quick, as opposed to the really deep bass tones that you get in a lot of his movies. But so if you want to get back to the movies, and we don't really know when everything's coming out at this point, but this is one of the first ones to really release in so many months. It's absolutely worth it to kind of shake off the stay at home vibes. Moving into spoilers, there's a little bit more that can be talked about here, and it's just that it didn't wrap up well. When you do time travel, there has to be some really specific rules that you attach to it, and this movie kind of shirks its own rules from beginning to end. When it first starts out, they make it really evident that only things like bullets and inanimate objects can move forwards and backwards, and that only very specific and few people in the world can actually do this. But by the end of the movie, you have entire literal armies moving back and forth through time. And it didn't make any sense why there was a full army battle at the end of the movie. It didn't add anything to it. It kind of just felt like a tacked on way to spend the rest of the money he had in the budget. It it didn't really work in the capacity that I think he was going for. It wasn't a Dunkirk. It wasn't really a battle scene. It felt lame, really. It wasn't a good fight. And there's this whole idea that the Russians are the bad guys here, and I guess technically the Western world are the good guys. But then when the Russians are attacked, they don't really prove to be any sort of enemy. There's not really a specific antagonist in the movie that you hate that much. There's the main guy who's a wife beater, and that's about the most negative thing they have about him. And then they show that he wants to destroy the world, but they don't really give you a reason. He's a very archetypal Bond villain that doesn't really go into the depths of, say, the Skyfall villain. So it feels very much almost like a 90s Bond movie, like a Pierce Brosnan Bond movie, with just a higher production value and some sort of modern, aesthetics. But as far as the story goes, the fact that the main character from the beginning, he's kind of living his life forward while his Edward Cullen buddy is working his life backwards. It doesn't really add to the story in any capacity. It really doesn't make you think. And I think that's the biggest problem with this movie is that when you leave the theater, you want to think about it, which is good. But the more you think about it, the more you realize it's not just small plot holes, it's the whole thing just doesn't add up. There's no full circle situation. Let me talk back in time to save the world, like in Interstellar, or any specific moments that you've had in his other movies like Inception, where you think about that specific moment and the possibilities that that really provides. So, you would think that in a time travel movie, especially in a movie where these characters like they can contact each other going backwards in time, there will be more moments like that where you're excited to see these characters interact with their past selves, but then you never really get excited about it. So because it breaks its own logic so many times when it's trying to do that, that you can't think about it too much. So a few times they mentioned the fact that you can't contact your former self because if you touch your former self in a past history, the whole world gets annihilated. Like there's some for whatever reason the whole world gets annihilated, right? But other characters that are moving back forward in time can touch each other, and it just it just doesn't make sense because there's a whole fight scene in the movie. One of the kind of centerpiece fights of the movie, it's the main character just attacking himself. To assume that he's so well covered that he's not touching himself, and they say something like, "Oh, as long as you're wearing gloves, you can't touch each other." It's like it has to be skin to skin contact. I don't know because there's so many times where you see the same item from the two different timelines coming into contact that it doesn't make sense why a person would do it, but not the gear that he's wearing. Beyond that, the female character in this movie, she's good. She has a certain level of agency, but by the end of the movie, they just turn her into kind of a vengeful lady. She doesn't really have the agency that she kind of initially shows that she kind of wants, and it doesn't carry the movie well. The actors in general, from start to finish, they don't really bring the gravitas of the situation that you would expect. And it's hard to talk about the movie from start to finish because it's so complicated and it's so. I guess I really haven't even talked about that many spoilers because you don't really spoil anything because I don't feel like there's really a story from start to finish. There's something about some algorithm that's going to go back in time and destroy the world for some reason because people in the future blame us for climate change, so they want to destroy all of history. It doesn't. It really, really, really kind of didn't make you think. It just made you think that you were being bamboozled more than it made you think, hey, this is something that's really important and something that I should think about. And what are the, concepts of the grandfather paradox? They kind of just gloss over it, almost in a Futurama level of glossing over it. Just like, hey, don't think about it. And then they continue doing what they're doing, right? So there's just certain times where they use that as a crutch to get through the story that they've convoluted on their own. So there's a scene where the main character, the protagonist, I don't give him a name for some reason. I think it's cool to just call him the protagonist. The protagonist, he gets in a car and the car explodes, and you think that maybe this timeline of him has died and the next timeline of him is going to be the one that saves it, right? But instead of doing that, they have some throwaway line about how because he's inverted time, fire is cold and cold is hot, and that's it. They just shove this line in there so that they can carve a little red herring that they just toss in there and never use in the movie again. It's almost like they got to that point in the story, they didn't know how to get out of it, so they toss in a little bit of dialogue earlier to make sure that it makes sense. And it doesn't add anything to the visual, right? There's one visual where the flames flicker a little bit and then the ice frost, his car explodes, and then the next scene he's just okay. He had hypothermia. So there's just it's hard to talk about the spoiler sides of the story because there are no real spoilers because nothing really happens in the movie, and that's probably the worst part. And then you find out what the title is. It's 10 minutes forwards and then 10 minutes backwards, and they meet together in the middle, where the climactic action scene is supposed to happen. But because the climactic action scene, the scene with the armies that all went back in time clash, doesn't really have any weight to it. Nothing's happening. It's just hundreds of nameless soldiers that just happen to show up halfway through the movie to solve the problem. And they're doing a back and forth time pincer maneuver, but they don't show when this pincer maneuver started or where it started on this end or that end. It's just there's hundreds of soldiers on both sides moving forwards and backwards. And it's just so hard to kind of wrap your head around it, and not in a temporal way, just in a logistical way, really. So I don't know. I wanted to like the movie more than I did. I did like the movie once again. I thought the soundtrack was great. The visuals were cool. The suits were really good. All the characters looked really nice all the time, which is nice. It's good to see a movie where, instead of being the king of Staten Island of a bunch of trashy people standing around being trashy, you have like fancy people being fancy. That's always nice. But overall, I would say if you have concerns about your wellness right now, it's not worth seeing. If you really just want to get out there and see a movie, go see it. But generally speaking, it's not a strong movie. It's not a thinker like most of Christopher Nolan movies are. It's just kind of a series of set pieces with a little bit of goofy, time travel stuff thrown in, and that's it. Honestly, if the movie had just moved forward without the time travel stuff, it would have been a better movie. And I think that's probably the weakest thing. If you remove all the time travel parts and just make it a madman trying to put together, an atom bomb that's coming backwards from the future, and removed everything else, and just trying to put the pieces together of the time travel portion, that would have been a pretty good movie. But as it stands, the way they try and make it work, it's too complicated to make it good. And I don't mean too complicated like people that see it are just a bunch of simpletons, and that's going to make it hard to wrap your head around. I mean complicated as in I don't think that the director or the screenwriter really got a handle on what they were trying to go for here. And there was a couple of misleading action scenes where you thought you're going to see a lot of time travel stuff happening, but when you only see one or two cars driving backwards or forwards, you've seen that in other movies. You see one car flip upside down, in reverse. That's okay, but even the visual portions where they tried to do that time travel mixed with regular time, it wasn't executed in a way that makes you feel like, wow, these two things are really colliding. There's certain parts where you could tell the character just running backwards in a scene that the rest of the scene is moving forwards. There's a couple of other scenes where you can just tell it was just CGI. So it never hits that level of, Inception, slowing down super slow, watching everybody's clothes and glass, move in the low gravity, or the interstellar giant wave and the people age. It never hits any of those highs. It just always stays pretty mediocre throughout. You stay confused. There's never any oh moments in this movie, and I think without those oh moments, it's not it's not really it's not really that Christopher Nolan movie you were expecting it to be. It's just another slightly above average James Bond movie. If I had to say anything. So at the end of the day, go watch it if you want to go see a movie nowadays. It's definitely the best one in theaters right now. Go watch it if you just want to go eat some popcorn. It's good enough for that. Don't go watch it if you're scared of going outside right now. Don't go watch it if you don't like Christopher Nolan movies or James Bond movies. Really, you know who you are if you're gonna like this movie. And even if you think you're gonna like it, maybe dial back your expectations a little bit. It's just not the high level highs that you usually expect from one of these movies. But outside of that, give it a shot. Let us know and have a good night.